Moving on to power and status. So status is how important members of a group think an individual's position is. So when we're thinking about status, we might think about high status and low status. So in a school, for example, it would be considered that the students have low status and the teacher would be of high status. And then power is the ability to influence or control the thoughts, feelings, or behaviors of others. And again, people and interactions are very complicated. So exploring a status and power and how people interact in that way is a very interesting field of study. Another definition that I heard about power was that a person is said or a person has power over another if there is a reasonable expectation that the person would do what the other person asked of them. So for example, in most case scenarios, it would be appropriate to say that your teacher has power over you because there's an expectation that you are going to obey what they ask you to do. So your teacher would have the ability to influence or control your behavior. So if, for example, a teacher set some work, there would be an expectation that you would do that. Or the same applies in a workplace. After you graduate high school, or some of you might already be in the workforce, if you have like a boss or a manager at work, they are, by definition, they're your boss. They actually do have that higher status, that power over you, because they're paying you to do what they want you to do. And when we're exploring power and status, we usually talk about the Stanford Prison Experiment. And this table here is talking about the different types of power. So the first type we have is coercive power. And that's the source of that is being able to give negative consequences. So for example, a parent is able to threaten to ground you if you do a certain action. So that's an example of coercive power. Another example would be prison guards and their prisoners. If a prison guard was going to threaten to hurt a prisoner, then that's coercive power. And again, is that a good type of power or a bad type of power? Interesting to think about. There's also expert power. So that's when somebody has like wanted or necessary special skills or knowledge. So for example, like a mentor. An example that I think of for this one is like a doctor. In a relationship between me and a doctor, I would consider that the doctor would be of higher status and I would be of the lowest status because that doctor has the expert power over me. I am going to my doctor because I need what they have to offer me. I need their help. I need their guidance. I need their expertise. It could be the same. It could be said the same with teachers as well. They have the knowledge that you need for your exam and they are going to teach it to you. The next one's informational power. So having access to useful information or resources not readily available elsewhere. So for example, if your friend has some information that you might be curious about, you could say that gives you informational power. I know, for example, I've seen it done in TV shows when they're like, I'll tell you this if you do these things for me. Those two people are peers, they're friends. They seem to have the same level of status or the same level of power because they're both peers. They have the same role, you could say, socially. But you could say that that one friend has informational power over the other one because they have something that the other person wants. So they might try be nice to them or do certain things for them to try and get that informational power. Legitimate power is a really interesting one, and that's a status or position which gives them authority over those with less status or authority. So it's like, for example, bosses, teachers, police. You could think of it as like official power. So legitimate power is kind of like our official power. And then we have referent power, which is others wanting to be like them or be liked by them. Wanting your friends to like you gives them referent power over you. This could come into context, this could be relevant when it comes to a lot of celebrities. If you really, really want to be like a celebrity, not that you're likely to have an interaction with them, but they do have that level of power over you. For example, think of Taylor Swift. If she told her fans that she wanted them to do something, they would likely go out and do that because they really like her. They really look up to them. If, for example, think about a little sibling following around their big sibling, and if they absolutely adore them, they're going to try and do things that their older sibling asks them to do because they look up to them. They have that referent power over them. And then we have reward power, which is being able to give positive consequences or remove negative consequences. So for example, that's kind of linking back in with our positive and our negative reinforcement. So again, teachers could do this with detentions. They have reward power because they could either, for example, give you a sticker on your behavior chart or a detention. That power is in their hands. And because they have that power, that's likely going to influence how we behave. So you can kind of see how those different kinds of power might come into play and which ones might be better or worse. So for example, what I'm trying to hint at with that is coercive power. I would say that's like quite a negative, not effective form of power, because if you're like threatening someone to make them be obedient, the person isn't compliant. They're not willing. They don't want to follow that power. They just have to, and they might actually try and rebel, for example. But if, for example, we look at referent power, when it's like, oh my goodness, I look up to you so much, I want to be like you, so I'm going to do whatever you say. That's a very strong type of power because you've sought out that model. You want to be like them. But the interesting thing there is, will that model use that for better or worse? For example, if that model is making bad choices, then the younger sibling might emulate that, and that might be a really negative thing. So again, all of our types of power, again, can be used for better or worse. Some are helpful, some can be detrimental. So have a think about all of that as well. So again, Stanford Prison Experiment on the syllabus is an experiment related to this. And it was unethical, highly unethical. If you remember much about it, it violated almost every right under the sun. For example, no harm, withdrawal rights, informed consent. They did not take that into regard at all. Like, they literally allowed the abuse and traumatizing of all of these people, and they did not know what they were signing up to. They were not informed of what was going to be done to them. They were not allowed to withdraw. And they were definitely physically and psychologically harmed. But before we get into that, let's define a group, because we've been talking about groups a lot already. So a group is two or more people who interact over a period of time and influence each other and have a common purpose. So when you think of a group, we have all of these different groups in societies. We could say, for example, there's like gender groups, like male, female. We could say there's like religious groups, Christian, atheist, other religious groups. You could also say there's like family groups. So I've got my family and then your family and then another person's family. We could say there's like sporting groups. State of origin is a big example for that. The Queensland supporters and the New South Wales supporters are two very opposing groups. And you can see in all of these examples, we have two or more people, because one person isn't exactly a group, that's just one person. They interact over a period of time. So there needs to be some level of interaction. They can't just have no interaction when they're not really a group. There needs to be some form of like influence, so kind of like caring what the other people are doing or thinking. And there's often a common purpose as well. So that's kind of how a group is often like defined or unified, you might say. So a quick review of the Stanford Prison Experiment. 18 participants were selected and randomly allocated to a role, either a guard, high status, coercive power, which we covered just before, or prisoners who are then that low status. Guards were de-individualized. They were given uniforms and like reflective sunglasses, and they were given whistles and batons to emphasize their authority, and they were encouraged to exert their coercive power. So in other words, they were encouraged to like threaten and abuse to make the low status prisoners do what they wanted them to, which is terrible and unethical. The prisoners were locked into cells. They were humiliated, mistreated, and observed. And they were also de-individualized to reduce their sense of self. So the guards, we have this kind of contrasting thing here. The guards were de-individualized to try and reduce their inhibitions. So, for example, to try and stop them from feeling bad about their negative behavior. And then the prisoners were de-individualized to like shame them and further degrade them and break them down and like humiliate them and give them that low status. So they were actually given like sacks, like smocks that like barely even like are covered their like covered their like private areas. So they were literally intentionally humiliated in that way. And then, like I said, on the other hand, we have the guards that were de-individualized. So that was, again, to try and make them not feel responsible and individually accountable for their terrible actions. So we have these opposing effects. And the Stanford Prison Experiment was about demonstrating the effects of power and status in a group. And the group here was like the prison environment. And the roles given to the guards and also to the prisoners were designed to influence their behavior. So this experiment was deliberately designed to see how the high-power guards and the low-status prisoners would interact in this kind of artificial like prison environment. Again, a very, very, very unethical experiment. And it kind of wanted to explore like what are the situational and social factors. Will they take personal responsibility for their actions? What will happen in this environment? And all of those different things. So that's a brief overview of the Stanford Prison Experiment, but I didn't go into complete depth about it. So, for example, what happened on days 1 through, I believe it's 6 of the experiment. How did the prisoners react? How did the guards behave? I will give you a little spoiler alert. The guards, at first, they weren't too bold. They didn't exert much of their coercive power. But as the experiment went on, they got more and more and more bold. They did terrible, like humiliating, degrading things to the prisoners, and they did use their high status power to manipulate and abuse the prisoners. And the prisoners kind of took it at first, but then they rebelled, and it had all of these interesting dynamics before the experiment was finally shut down at around day 6. But again, I haven't gone into a whole lot of depth with the Stanford Prison Experiment. There's actually a lot of really, really interesting documentaries and websites and summaries around this. So I definitely encourage you to do some research on it. And this is a really great way for active learning, because you're actively learning all of that information, making those connections, making sense of the findings and all of those different things. And this slide here isn't just helpful for the Stanford Prison Experiment. This is actually a really good guide to help you analyze any of the different experiments that you need to know to a certain level of depth. Because I've given you a bit of a structure and an outline of like what are the key things that you need to know for the studies. Some studies that they talk about in the syllabus, again, comes back to the cognitive verbs. Some of the studies go into quite a lot of detail. You might be told that you need to be able to evaluate them, which means you need to talk about the strengths, the limitations, the implications, what were the findings, all of that. What does that tell us about what we're learning? But some of the case studies are only very briefly kind of referred to, and you won't need to know those ones in as much depth, maybe just like a brief summary. But if you want to know the study in a bit more detail, like I said, especially if you need to evaluate it, these are kind of the main questions you need to be able to answer. So, for example, the motivation and the aim. And this kind of links in with the background. So motivation, aim, background. What maybe even like, what was motivating them to do their research? What did they want to learn about? What topic were they exploring? Why did they want to know that? All of those kinds of things. And then also like the method. So, for example, participants, materials. Was it like a big study conducted over like multiple countries where they collected all this data? Or was it the Stanford Prison Experiment where they picked 18 people and then did terrible things to them? And then procedures, kind of the same thing as method. Then we've also got results. So you got that might be number data. It might be, you definitely don't need to remember or like memorize the number data, but you need to know roughly like what were the results, which when you're answering in an exam would be very much linked in with conclusions. So that's kind of where you interpret the results. So it's what did they find? What did they learn? What does this mean in terms of what we're learning? And then also if you've got to go that deeper level with evaluation, then you also might want to talk about criticisms or limitations. I have a few good ones that are usually good to go to, often with a lot of these older studies. A criticism or limitation of most of them, you can usually jump straight to ethics. So ethically, it was terrible. And then you can also look at other like criticisms in like their design, for example. Like, for example, does it have low or high ecological validity? Which is referring to like, do these findings, are they actually relevant outside of the context of the study, or was it conducted in like too narrow of like an artificial simulation? So we actually don't know if this psychological phenomena we think we've identified in this small study, does it apply to like the real wider world? That's like, those are a few limitations that are relevant to a lot of studies. So yeah, definitely keep those in mind and keep these kind of main points in mind as well. All right, our next section is obedience and conformity.